Despite the disagreements between the emperor and the Crusader princes over their ultimate claims and how future conquests should be divided, there was no dispute regarding the initial phase of the campaign against the Muslims. If the Crusaders were to reach Jerusalem, the path through Asia Minor had to be secured to expel the Turks from the region. On strategic matters, there was full consensus, and for the time being, with Byzantine forces fighting alongside them, the Crusaders were content to rely on the seasoned tactical expertise of the empire's commanders. Their first target was the Seljuk capital, Nicaea. Positioned on the edge of Lake Ascania and not far from the Sea of Marmara, Nicaea sat directly on the old Byzantine military route, though an alternate road lay slightly farther east. Leaving such a formidable stronghold in enemy hands would jeopardize all movement and communication across Asia Minor. Emperor Alexius was eager to push the Crusaders forward quickly, as summer was fast approaching and the Crusaders themselves were growing restless. In the final days of April, before the arrival of the northern French forces in Constantinople, orders were issued to break camp at Pelicanum and advance toward Nicaea. The timing proved ideal. The Seljuk Sultan, Kilij Arslan I, was then occupied on his eastern frontier, engaged in a power struggle with the Danishmend princes for control over Melitene. The local Armenian leader, Gabriel, was actively stirring conflict among the neighboring rulers. Kilij Arslan did not view this new Western force as a serious threat. His earlier victory over the undisciplined followers of Peter the Hermit had led him to underestimate the Crusaders. Moreover, reports from his informants in Constantinople may have exaggerated the tensions between the emperor and the Western leaders. Confident that the crusade posed no real danger to Nicaea, he left his family and his wealth within the city walls. It was only upon learning that the Crusader forces were assembling at Pelicanum that he dispatched part of his army westward, following them himself as soon as he could resolve matters in the east. However, his forces arrived too late to prevent the Crusaders from moving on Nicaea. Godfrey of Lorraine's forces departed from Pelicanum around April 26th and advanced toward Nicomedia. There, they paused for 3 days, during which they were joined by Bohemond's contingent, led by Tancred, along with Peter the Hermit and the remnants of his disorganized followers. Bohemond remained in Constantinople a few days longer to coordinate supply arrangements with the emperor. A small unit of Byzantine engineers, accompanied by siege equipment and led by Manuel Budamites, joined the advancing Crusader army. From Nicomedia, Godfrey led his troops to Civitate, then veered south through the narrow mountain pass where Peter's followers had previously been slaughtered. Their bones still littered the entrance of the gorge. Heeding the emperor's warnings and the grim sight before him, Godfrey proceeded carefully. Scouts and engineers were sent ahead to clear and widen the path, which was then marked with wooden crosses to guide future pilgrims. On May 6th, his forces reached the outskirts of Nicaea. Nicaea, fortified since the 4th century, was surrounded by 4 miles of walls strengthened by 240 towers, kept in good condition by the Byzantines. The city stood at the eastern edge of Lake Ascania, with its western walls rising directly from the shallow waters, forming an irregular pentagon in shape. Godfrey set up camp outside the northern wall, while Tancred positioned his forces to the east. The southern section was reserved for Raymond's army. Although the Turkish garrison inside the city was considerable, it was in urgent need of reinforcements. Messengers were dispatched to the Sultan, urging him to send troops quickly through the southern gates before the siege was fully in place. One of these messengers was intercepted by the Crusaders. However, the Turkish main army was still too distant. Before it could arrive, Raymond reached the city on May 16th and positioned his forces along the southern wall. Bohemond had rejoined his troops a few days earlier. Until then, the Crusaders had struggled with inadequate supplies, but thanks to the logistical arrangements made with Alexius, provisions soon began arriving steadily by both land and sea. By June 3rd, with the arrival of Robert of Normandy and Stephen of Blois, the entire crusading force was assembled. Although there was no overall commander, the army operated in unison, with strategic decisions made collectively by the leading princes. At this stage, there was still no significant conflict among them. Meanwhile, the emperor relocated to Pelicanum to remain in close contact with both Nicaea and Constantinople. The first Turkish relief detachment reached the city shortly after Raymond's arrival, only to find it entirely encircled by land. After a short and unsuccessful clash with Raymond's forces, it withdrew to wait for the main army led by the Sultan himself. Following the emperor's orders, Butymites attempted to open negotiations with the defenders inside Nicaea. As the garrison realized that their relief had retreated, their leaders extended an invitation to Butymites to enter the city under a safe conduct and discuss surrender terms. He agreed, but shortly afterward, news came that the Sultan's army was approaching, prompting the defenders to break off the talks. Around May 21st, the Sultan and his army arrived from the south and immediately launched an offensive against the Crusaders, attempting to break into the city. Raymond, supported on his right flank by the Bishop of Le Puy, bore the main force of the assault, as neither Godfrey nor Bohemond could afford to leave their own sections of the wall unguarded. However, Robert of Flanders came to Raymond's support with his troops. The fighting continued with great intensity throughout the day, but the Turks failed to make any significant progress. As night fell, the Sultan chose to retreat. He had underestimated the strength of the Crusader forces, and his men were no match for the heavily armed Western Knights in the open terrain outside the city walls. Strategically, it made more sense to fall back into the mountains and abandon Nicaea to its fate. Despite their success, the Crusaders had suffered considerable casualties. Many were killed, including Baldwin, Count of Ghent, and nearly all who fought were injured. Yet, their spirits were high after the victory. Among the fallen Turks, they discovered ropes intended for binding captured Crusaders. To further demoralize the defenders inside the city, the Crusaders decapitated many of the enemy dead and hurled the heads over the walls or mounted them on spikes near the gates. Now free from the threat of outside attack, the Crusaders focused fully on the siege. But the city's defenses were formidable. Raymond and Edhemer attempted to undermine one of the southern towers by sending sappers to tunnel beneath it and set a fire. However, the minor damage caused was quickly repaired by the defenders overnight. In addition, the besiegers discovered that their blockade was not fully effective. Faced with this challenge, the Crusaders appealed to the emperor for help, requesting boats to cut off the lake-based supply route. Alexius was likely already aware of the situation, but may have allowed the Crusaders to come to this realization themselves to emphasize their dependence on his support. Responding to their plea, he sent a small fleet under the command of Butymites to patrol the lake. When the Sultan withdrew, he had instructed the garrison to act according to its own judgment, as no further aid could be expected. Once the defenders saw Byzantine ships on the lake and realized that the emperor was fully backing the crusade, they began to consider surrender. This outcome was precisely what Alexius had hoped for. He had no interest in claiming a ruined city or subjecting its mostly Christian population to the horrors of sack. The Turkish presence within Nicaea was limited to the military and a small noble class. Negotiations resumed with Butymites, and terms of surrender were discussed. However, the garrison hesitated, perhaps still holding out hope for the Sultan's return. Only when they learned that the Crusaders were preparing for a full-scale assault did they finally decide to yield. The assault was scheduled for June 19th. However, as dawn broke, the Crusaders were surprised to see the emperor's banner flying atop the towers of Nicaea. During the night, the Turks had surrendered, and imperial forces had entered the city through the lakeside gates. It's unlikely that the Crusader leaders had been completely unaware of the negotiations. Still, they did not object, recognizing that launching an attack on a city they would not ultimately control would be a waste of both time and lives. Yet they were intentionally excluded from the final arrangements, and this secrecy fueled resentment among the rank and file, who felt they had been robbed of their rightful spoils. Many Crusaders had anticipated looting the city's wealth, but instead, they were only permitted to enter in small groups under strict supervision by the emperor's guards. They had hoped to capture and ransom Turkish nobles, only to watch them being escorted to Constantinople or to the emperor's camp at Pelicanum. This deepened their hostility toward Alexius. However, some of this bitterness was softened by the emperor's acts of generosity. Alexius ordered that every Crusader soldier receive a gift of food, and he summoned the Crusader leaders to Pelicanum, where they were presented with gold and jewels taken from the Sultan's treasury. Stephen of Blois, who traveled there with Raymond of Toulouse, was overwhelmed by the wealth he received and stood in awe of the golden treasures allotted to him. Unlike some of his fellow knights, Stephen did not believe the emperor should have come to Nicaea in person. He understood that the public ceremony marking the city's return to imperial rule might have been awkward for Alexius to attend directly. In exchange for these generous gifts, Alexius requested that the knights who had not yet sworn allegiance to him do so now. Many of the lesser nobles, whom the emperor had previously ignored when they passed through Constantinople, agreed to take the oath. Raymond, apparently, was not asked to make any further commitments. Tancred's case, however, was treated more seriously. Initially defiant, Tancred declared that unless he received the emperor's grand tent filled with gold, along with a sum equal to what had been given to all the other princes, he would refuse to swear loyalty. When George Palaeologus, the emperor's brother-in-law, objected to his insolence, Tancred reacted violently and physically assaulted him. The emperor stood to intervene, and Bohemond sharply scolded his nephew. Eventually, Tancred gave in and reluctantly pledged homage. The Crusaders were also taken aback by the emperor's treatment of the captured Turks. High-ranking officers and court figures were permitted to buy their freedom. The Sultan's wife, who was the daughter of Emir Shaka, was received in Constantinople with royal honors. She was to remain there until her husband sent word regarding where she should join him. She and her children would then be sent to him without any demand for ransom. Alexius, known for his compassion, understood the power of showing respect to a defeated foe. But to the Western lords, his actions appeared insincere and even disloyal. Although some Crusaders were disappointed that they had neither captured Nicaea themselves nor claimed its treasures, the city's liberation brought a renewed sense of joy and optimism. News was sent west proclaiming that this ancient city had once again returned to Christian hands, and the announcement was met with enthusiasm. The success at Nicaea affirmed the legitimacy of the crusade. Inspired by the victory, new volunteers came forward to join the cause, and the Italian cities began to show greater seriousness and support for the campaign. Within the Crusader camp, morale was high, and the knights were eager to press on toward their ultimate goal. Stephen of Blois expressed his confidence in a letter to his wife, writing, "In 5 weeks, we will be in Jerusalem, unless," he added with unintentional foresight, "we are delayed at Antioch." From Nicaea, the Crusaders proceeded along the old Byzantine military highway that crossed Asia Minor. This main road connected the route from Chalcedon and Nicomedia with the road coming from Helenopolis and Nicaea, converging at the banks of the Sangarius River. From there, the road veered south, following a tributary valley past modern-day Balsic, and continued over a mountain pass toward Dorylaeum, near present-day Eskişehir. At Dorylaeum, the route divided into 3 main paths. The primary Byzantine military road stretched eastward, likely bypassing Ancyra to the south. After crossing the Halys River, it split again. One branch led directly through Sebastia, modern Shivas, into Armenia, while the other turned toward Caesarea Mazaca. From there, several roads crossed the Anti-Taurus mountain range into the Euphrates Valley. Another route turned southwest, passing through Tyana and eventually reaching the Cilician Gates. A second road from Dorylaeum cut across the vast central salt desert of Asia Minor, running just south of Lake Tata from Amorium to the Cilician Gates. Due to the barren terrain and lack of water, this route was only suitable for small, fast-moving units. The third road followed the southern edge of the salt desert, extending from Philomelium, modern Axahir, to Iconium and Heraclea, then on to the Cilician Gates. From near Philomelium, one branch led to the Mediterranean port of Italia, while another, just beyond Iconium, led to Seleucia on the coast. Regardless of which path the Crusaders would ultimately follow, their first destination had to be Dorylaeum. On June 26th, 1 week after Nicaea's fall, the vanguard set out. Over the next 2 days, the remaining divisions followed, regrouping at the bridge over the Blue River, where the road departed from the Sangarius Valley and ascended to the Anatolian Plateau. The Crusaders were accompanied by a small Byzantine contingent under the seasoned General Titius. Some members of the Crusader force remained behind to serve the emperor. These men were placed under the command of Beutamites and tasked with repairing and garrisoning the city. At a village called Lus, near the bridge, the Crusader leaders met to discuss their next steps. To reduce pressure on local resources, they agreed to split the army into 2 groups, traveling a day apart. The first group was composed of the Normans from southern Italy and northern France, along with the forces of the Counts of Flanders and Blois, and the Byzantines, who also served as guides. The second group included the southern French, the men of Lorraine, and the troops under the Count of Vermandois. Bohemond was appointed leader of the first division, while Raymond of Toulouse commanded the second. Once the division was settled, Bohemond's army began its march toward Dorylaeum. After failing to relieve Nicaea, Sultan Kilij Arslan retreated eastward to regroup his forces and forge an alliance with the Danishmend Emir to confront the growing threat posed by the Crusaders. The loss of Nicaea had shaken him, especially the forfeiture of his treasury, which was a significant blow. Still, the Turks retained a nomadic mindset. The Sultan's true seat of power was wherever he pitched his tent. In the final days of June, he began moving back westward with his own army, accompanied by his vassal Hassan, emir of the Cappadocian Turks, and the forces of the Danishmend Emir. By June 30th, they had taken up position in a valley near Dorylaeum, lying in wait to ambush the Crusaders as they descended from the pass. That evening, the Crusader vanguard set up camp in the plain near Dorylaeum. At sunrise, the Turks launched a sudden assault, pouring down the hillsides with fierce cries. But Bohemond had anticipated the possibility of attack. He swiftly gathered the non-combatant pilgrims into the center of the camp, where natural springs provided water. Women were assigned the task of carrying water to the front lines. Tents were hastily fortified, and the knights were instructed to dismount and fight on foot. A rider was immediately dispatched to alert the Second Army and urge them to hurry to their aid. Meanwhile, Bohemond rallied his captains, warning them to prepare for a hard battle and to maintain a defensive stance at the start. Only one knight disobeyed these orders, the same man who had once arrogantly seated himself on the emperor's throne in Constantinople. Leading 40 of his men, he charged into the enemy lines but was quickly repelled and returned, severely wounded and humiliated. Soon, the camp was encircled by a seemingly endless horde of Turkish warriors. Using their usual tactic, waves of archers ran forward to release volleys of arrows before swiftly retreating to let others take their place. As the heat of the July morning intensified, doubts spread among the Crusaders about whether they could withstand the relentless assault. Surrounded and unable to flee, they knew surrender meant slavery. Many resolved to die as martyrs rather than give in. But around midday, they saw salvation approaching. The Second Army had arrived. Godfrey and Hugh led the front, followed closely by Raymond and his troops. The Turks, unaware that the Crusader forces had been divided, had believed they were facing the full army and were taken by surprise. They hesitated, unable to stop the 2 groups from linking up. The Crusaders, now united and reinvigorated, formed a broad battle line. Bohemond, Robert of Normandy, and Stephen of Blois took the left. Raymond and Robert of Flanders held the center, and Godfrey and Hugh commanded the right. Inspired by the promise of victory and the riches it could bring, they launched a counterattack. The Turks, caught off guard and likely running low on ammunition, began to falter. Panic spread when a new threat appeared behind them. The Bishop of Le Puy and a detachment of southern French troops had descended from the hills. Edhemer had planned this flanking maneuver in advance, navigating through the mountain trails with the help of local guides. His timely intervention sealed the Crusader victory. The Turkish lines collapsed, and their army fled eastward in disarray. In their rush to escape, they abandoned their entire camp. The Sultan's tent, along with those of his emirs and all their treasure, fell into the hands of the Crusaders. The victory was a significant one. Though it came at the cost of many Christian lives, it marked a turning point. The Franks gained a newfound respect for the military strength of the Turks. In fact, perhaps to elevate the importance of their own success, they often expressed admiration for the Turks, even more than for the Byzantines, whose more strategic and methodical approach to warfare they dismissed as overly refined or decadent. The Byzantine contribution to the battle received little acknowledgement from the Crusaders. The anonymous Norman chronicler of Edessa even remarked that the Turks might be the noblest of peoples. He cited an old tale linking the Franks and the Turks as descendants of the Trojans, a myth born more from shared rivalry with the Greeks than from any real ethnic connection. Yet, however worthy the Turkish soldiers may have been, their defeat opened the way for the Crusaders to move safely through Asia Minor. Having lost both his capital and much of his treasure, the Sultan saw no point in continuing resistance. Encountering a group of Syrian Turks who had arrived too late for the battle, he confessed that he had underestimated the strength and numbers of the Franks and could no longer oppose them effectively. Retreating into the hills, he and his forces looted and abandoned the towns they had once occupied, leaving the countryside ravaged in an attempt to deprive the Crusaders of food as they advanced. After their victory, the Crusaders paused for 2 days at Dorylaeum to recover and to plan their next move. Choosing the route ahead was relatively straightforward. The main military road to the east cut through regions still controlled by the Danishmends and powerful local emirs. The Crusader army, being too large and slow to risk a direct path across the central salt desert, had to take the longer route along the southern edge of the desert, near the mountain foothills. This was almost certainly the advice of Titius and his Byzantine guides. Even so, the road ahead was uncertain. Years of Turkoman raids and prolonged warfare had left villages destroyed, fields abandoned, walls polluted or dry, and many bridges in ruins. Reliable information was hard to gather from the sparse and fearful local population. Whenever obstacles arose, the Franks were quick to accuse the Greek guides of betrayal, while the Greeks, frustrated by the undisciplined and ungrateful behavior of the Franks, grew increasingly resentful. Titius found his role ever more difficult and unpleasant. On July 3rd, the Crusader army resumed its march, this time remaining together in a single, unified column to avoid the dangers experienced at Dorylaeum. They moved southeastward across the Anatolian plateau, but could not stick to the old imperial road. After passing through Polybotis, they veered toward Pisidian Antioch. From there, they crossed the bare mountain passes of the Sultan Dag and rejoined the main route at Philomelium. Beyond Philomelium, the path led through a bleak and arid region lying between the mountains and the desert. Under the searing midsummer sun, both heavily armored knights and foot soldiers endured great suffering. Water was nowhere to be found except for the briny marshes of the desert, and vegetation was limited to thorny shrubs, whose branches were chewed in desperation to relieve thirst. Along the roadside stood the remains of old Byzantine cisterns. Horses were the first to succumb to the conditions. Many knights were forced to march on foot. Others were seen riding oxen, while sheep, goats, and even dogs were recruited to drag supply wagons. Despite these hardships, the Crusaders' morale remained remarkably strong. To Fulcher of Chartres, the unity and camaraderie among soldiers from so many different lands and languages seemed nothing short of divinely inspired. By mid-August, the Crusaders arrived at Iconium, which had been under Turkish control for 13 years. Though it would soon become Kilij Arslan's new capital, the city was deserted at the time. The Turks had retreated into the mountains, taking with them whatever they could carry. However, they could not take away the flowing streams or the lush orchards in the beautiful Merom Valley behind the city. The valley's rich fertility amazed the exhausted Crusaders, who took the opportunity to rest there for several days and regain their strength. The entire army was in dire need of rest. Even the leaders were suffering. Godfrey had recently been injured while hunting a bear, and Raymond of Toulouse was gravely ill, believed to be near death. The Bishop of Orange administered the last rites. Yet the stop in Iconium proved restorative, and Raymond recovered enough to continue the march with the rest of the army. Heeding the advice of the small Armenian population living nearby, the Crusaders stocked up on water before pressing on toward the fertile valley of Heraclea. At Heraclea, they encountered a Turkish force commanded by Emir Hassan and the Danishman Emir. These leaders, concerned for their holdings in Cappadocia, may have hoped that their presence would persuade the Crusaders to attempt a difficult crossing of the Taurus Mountains toward the coast. But rather than being deterred, the Crusaders immediately launched an assault. Bohemond led the charge and sought out the Danishman Emir directly. The Turks, unwilling to engage in a full-scale battle, quickly withdrew to the north, leaving the towns for the Crusaders to claim. Their victory was marked by a comet streaking through the sky. With the road ahead now open, the leaders met once more to decide their next steps. Just east of Heraclea, the main road crossed the formidable Taurus Mountains through the Cilician Gates. However, the route was fraught with danger. Its steep and constricted terrain made it easy for even a small enemy force to ambush and devastate a slow-moving army. Additionally, Cilicia remained in Turkish hands, and the intense heat in September, well known to the Byzantine guides, posed a serious threat. Worse still, any army passing through Cilicia en route to Antioch would have to tackle another difficult pass over the Amanus Mountains, known as the Syrian Gates. An alternative had now become available thanks to the Turks' recent defeat. The road to Caesarea Mazaca offered another viable route. From Caesarea, the old Byzantine military road extended across the Anti-Taurus Mountains to Marash, and from there descended through the wide, lower Amanus Gates into the plains surrounding Antioch. Before the Turkish invasions, this route had served as the main artery connecting Antioch to Constantinople. It also offered the advantage of passing through territories controlled by Christian Armenian princes, many of whom were nominally loyal to the Byzantine Emperor and generally favorable to the Crusader cause. This second route was likely recommended by Titius and the Byzantine advisors, but opposition arose from Crusader leaders hostile to the emperor, led by Tancred. In the end, most of the army chose the road through Caesarea. However, Tancred, with a contingent of southern Italian Normans and Baldwin, Godfrey's brother, accompanied by some Flemish and Lorrainer troops, opted to separate from the main force and make their way into Cilicia. Around September 10th, Tancred and Baldwin each departed by separate routes to cross the Taurus Mountains, while the main Crusader force marched northeast toward Caesarea. Along the way, near the village of Augustopolis, the Crusaders encountered Emir Hassan's forces and dealt them another defeat. However, in an effort to avoid delays, they chose not to besiege a nearby fortress belonging to the emir. Instead, they occupied several small villages, which were granted to a local Armenian noble named Simeon, who agreed to govern them under the authority of the Byzantine emperor. By the end of the month, the Crusaders reached Caesarea, which had already been abandoned by the Turks. They did not remain there, but continued on to Comana, a flourishing Armenian town then under siege by Danishmen Turks. At the Crusaders' arrival, the Turkish besiegers quickly retreated. Though the Bohemians set off in pursuit, he was unable to catch them. The citizens of Comana welcomed their liberators warmly and agreed to accept a Byzantine-appointed governor. Titius named Peter of Alps, a Provençal knight who had previously served under Guiscard before entering imperial service. The appointment was well received and demonstrated that, at least for the moment, cooperation between the Franks and Byzantines was still functioning in accordance with the agreement made between the princes and the emperor. From Comana, the army moved southeast to Koksan, modern-day Goksan, a thriving Armenian town nestled in a fertile valley at the base of the Anti-Taurus range. The Crusaders paused there for 3 days, enjoying the hospitality of the local population and gathering ample provisions for the challenging journey ahead across the mountains. During this time, a rumor reached the camp that the Turks had abandoned Antioch. Bohemond was still away, pursuing the Danishman forces, so Raymond of Toulouse, without broad consultation, decided to act on the news. He sent 500 knights, led by Peter of Castillon, to quickly advance and seize the city. The knights rode swiftly, but upon arriving at a Paulician-held castle near the Orontes River, they learned that the rumor was false. Peter of Castillon appears to have returned to the main army. However, one of his knights, Peter of Roix, took matters into his own hands. With a small band of companions, he launched an independent raid, defeating local Turkish forces and capturing a number of forts and villages in the Ruja Valley near Aleppo, aided by the support of Armenian locals. Although Raymond's intent may have been focused more on achieving glory and seizing spoils than on securing control of Antioch itself, Bohemond, upon his return, viewed the action with distrust. The incident revealed the widening rift between the Crusader leaders. The next leg of the journey, from Coxon onward, proved to be the most grueling part of the entire expedition. It was now early October, and the autumn rains had begun. The route over the Anti-Taurus Mountains was in dreadful condition. Horses lost their footing and plunged off the cliffs. Lines of pack animals, tied together, would fall one after another into the ravines. Riders dismounted, as no one dared to remain on horseback. Knights, burdened by their heavy armor, struggled to continue, and many tried to sell their gear or abandon it altogether in despair. The harshness of the mountains claimed more lives than any enemy battle. Relief only came when the army finally emerged into the welcoming valley that surrounded Marash. At Marash, where the Crusaders once again encountered a welcoming Armenian community, they paused for several days. The town was ruled by Thatul, an Armenian prince and former Byzantine official, who was confirmed in his authority. During this time, Bohemond rejoined the army after his unsuccessful chase of the Turks. Baldwin also arrived from Cilicia to see his wife, Godvir, who was dying. After her passing, he resumed his journey eastward. Around October 15th, the main Crusader army left Marash, rejuvenated and prepared, and descended into the plain of Antioch. By the 20th, they reached the Iron Bridge, located just a few hours from the city. It had been 4 months since the Crusade departed for Nicaea. Considering the immense size of the army, which included many non-combatants, and the challenges of traversing dry, hostile terrain during the heat of summer while facing a swift and dangerous enemy, their progress was extraordinary. Their strength stemmed not only from their faith and determination to reach the Holy Land, but also from hopes of wealth and noble titles. Additionally, the Byzantine guides who accompanied them played a crucial role. Their deep knowledge of Turkish tactics and the region's geography allowed them to provide invaluable direction. Though occasional misjudgments occurred, these were understandable given that many roads had fallen into disrepair or been deliberately damaged over the past 2 decades. Despite the hardships, Titius maintained cordial relations with the Western leaders throughout the journey to Antioch. Although many common soldiers remained suspicious of the Greeks, the expedition as a whole continued to function smoothly. Meanwhile, Emperor Alexius was securing the Crusaders' rear by re-establishing Christian control across Asia Minor. The Crusaders' early victories had pushed the Seljuks and Danishmends into an uneasy alliance, creating the potential for renewed Turkish resistance in central and eastern Anatolia. In response, Alexius focused on reclaiming the western part of the peninsula. With the growing strength of the Byzantine navy, he aimed to secure a reliable supply route along the southern coast. After reinforcing Nicaea and securing strategic fortresses along the road to Dorylaeum, Alexius sent his brother-in-law, Caesar John Ducas, supported by a naval squadron under Admiral Caspax, to recapture Ionia and Phrygia. The principal target was Smyrna, still under the control of Shaka's son, who ruled much of the Ionian coast and nearby islands, including Lesbos, Chios, and Samos. Other coastal towns like Ephesus remained under the control of his vassals. The inland region of Phrygia was held by isolated Seljuk warlords cut off from the Sultan. To impress the Turks and assert legitimacy, John Ducas brought with him the Sultana, who had not yet been sent to her husband. The combined land and naval offensive proved overwhelming for the emir of Smyrna, who surrendered his territories in exchange for safe passage eastward. He escorted his sister to the Sultan's court, after which he disappears from historical record. Ephesus fell soon after with minimal resistance. While Caspak secured the coastal towns and islands, Ducas pushed inland, capturing major Lydian cities such as Sardis, Philadelphia, and Laodicea. By the end of autumn in 1097, the entire province was under Byzantine control. John Ducas prepared to continue his advance into Phrygia once winter passed, aiming to re-establish control over the road from Polybotis and Philomelium down to Italia. This route would extend along the southern coast, guarded by naval power and connected to Armenian-held territories in the Taurus Mountains. With this secure line, supplies could flow reliably to Crusader forces fighting in Syria, enabling a sustained and unified Christian campaign. The Armenian migration to the southwest, which began when the Seljuk invasions made life in the Araxes Valley and around Lake Van increasingly unsafe, continued throughout the closing years of the 11th century. By the time the Crusaders reached Eastern Asia Minor, a chain of small Armenian principalities extended from beyond the central Euphrates into the heart of the Taurus Mountains. The short-lived state established by the Armenian leader Philoretus had already collapsed before his death in 1090. However, Thuras still held power in Edessa, having recently succeeded in expelling the Turkish garrison from the citadel. His father-in-law, Gabriel, remained in control of Melitene. At Marash, Thatul, the leading Christian figure in the town, was confirmed as governor by the Byzantine authorities after the Crusaders restored the city to them. Further east, at Rabin and Kaisun, an Armenian named Kok Vasil, also known as Vasil the Robber, had carved out his own small domain. Thuras, Gabriel, and likely Thatul as well had all begun their public careers within the Byzantine administration, serving under Philoretus. Though ethnically Armenian, they were aligned with the Orthodox Church rather than the Armenian Church and continued to use imperial titles granted by the emperor long ago. They made efforts to maintain contact with Constantinople and regularly reaffirmed their allegiance to the Byzantine court. Thuras had even received the high-ranking title of Chiropolates from Emperor Alexius. This imperial association lent a degree of legitimacy to their rule, though a more practical form of survival came through their willingness to accept the overlordship of neighboring Turkish warlords. Thuras was particularly skilled at playing rival Turkish leaders against one another to maintain his independence, while Gabriel had gone as far as sending his wife on a diplomatic mission to Baghdad to gain recognition from leading Muslim authorities. Still, the position of these Armenian rulers was precarious. Apart from Kok Vasil, they were religiously distinct from most of their fellow Armenians and faced hostility from the numerous Syrian Christians living in their lands. They were also distrusted by the Turks, who only tolerated their presence due to internal divisions. In the Taurus Mountains, the Armenian communities were better protected. The region was difficult to access and could be easily defended. Ashin, the son of Hethum, controlled the mountains west of the Cilician Gates from his stronghold at Lamprin. Ashin maintained occasional ties with Constantinople and had been granted the Byzantine title of Stratopodarch of Cilicia. Though likely not a member of the Orthodox Church, he had once served under Alexius and had likely taken over Lamprin from its still intact Byzantine garrison with the emperor's tacit approval. From Lamprin, Ashin frequently launched raids into the Cilician plain. In 1097, taking advantage of Turkish distraction caused by the Crusaders' advance, he succeeded in capturing part of the town of Adana. East of the Cilician Gates, another Armenian prince, Constantine, son of Rupin, held sway. His main fortress was Partsepert, northwest of Sis. Since his father's death, Constantine had expanded eastward toward the anti-Taurus mountains and had seized the fortress of Vaca, situated on the Goksu River, from an isolated Byzantine garrison. A strong supporter of the Armenian Apostolic Church, Constantine inherited his father's deep-seated animosity toward Byzantium, rooted in the legacy of the Bagratid dynasty. Like Ashin, he sought to exploit Turkish weakness to establish a stronger position for himself in the fertile Cilician plain, where Armenians already formed a large part of the population. Baldwin of Boulogne had shown a growing interest in Armenian affairs for some time. At Nicaea, he formed a close bond with an Armenian named Bagrat, a former official in the Byzantine service and brother of Coke Vasil. Bagrat soon joined Baldwin's entourage. It's likely that Bagrat hoped to gain Baldwin's support for the Armenian principalities along the Euphrates, where his family had deep ties. When Tancred announced at Heraclea his intention to leave the main army and try his fortune in Cilicia, Baldwin quickly realized it would be unwise to let another Western noble be the first to establish influence among the Armenians. If he hoped to become their main ally, he would need to act. There is little reason to believe that Baldwin and Tancred had coordinated their plans. Both were younger sons from noble families with limited prospects in Europe, and both were determined to carve out domains for themselves in the East. However, Baldwin had already set his sights on forming an Armenian-based state, while Tancred appeared more flexible. Tancred opposed the detour to Caesarea mainly because it was a Byzantine suggestion, and he had little interest in actions that would benefit the empire. Moreover, the nearby Christian population presented him with a strategic opening. Around September 15th, Tancred departed the Crusader camp at Heraclea with a small force of about 100 knights and 200 infantrymen, heading straight for the Cilician gates. Shortly thereafter, Baldwin followed with a larger contingent, including his cousin Baldwin of Labourg, Reynold of Toul, and Peter of Stenay. Neither group included non-combatants. Baldwin's wife, Godvir, and their children remained with the main force. Tancred appears to have taken the most direct route to the pass, traveling along what is now the modern railway line through Ulukisla. Baldwin, with a heavier and slower army, opted for the older route descending from Tyana to Podandus at the head of the defile. As a result, he was 3 days behind Tancred in reaching the plain. Once through the mountains, Tancred advanced on Tarsus, then the leading city in Cilicia. He also sent word back to the main army requesting reinforcements. Tarsus was defended by a Turkish garrison, which launched an immediate attack to repel Tancred's forces but was driven back with heavy losses. The city's Christian residents then approached Tancred and urged him to take control. However, the Turks held their position until Baldwin's army came into view 3 days later. Faced with overwhelming numbers, the garrison slipped away under cover of night. The next morning, the Christian inhabitants opened the city gates to Tancred, whose banner soon flew over its towers. But Baldwin arrived soon afterward to find the city already claimed. Tancred had not brought any Byzantine officials with him, and clearly had no intention of surrendering his gains to the emperor. Yet Baldwin proved an even more formidable rival. Baldwin demanded that control of Tarsus be handed over to him. Though enraged, Tancred recognized he lacked the strength to resist and was compelled to comply. He withdrew his forces and set off eastward toward Adana. Baldwin had barely secured control of Tarsus when a contingent of 300 Norman soldiers arrived from a main army, sent to reinforce Tancred. Despite their pleas, Baldwin refused them entry into the city. While they camped outside the walls, they were attacked at night by remnants of the Turkish garrison who had been roaming the surrounding countryside. All were slaughtered. The incident sent shockwaves through the Crusader ranks. Even Baldwin's own troops held him responsible, and his position might have been seriously compromised. Word soon arrived that a Christian fleet had unexpectedly appeared in the Bay of Mersine, near the mouth of the Cydnus River, just below Tarsus. The fleet was commanded by Geimer of Boulogne. A seasoned pirate, Geimer had anticipated that the crusade would require naval support. In the spring, he had assembled a force of fellow seafarers and sailed from the Low Countries, hoping to link up with the Crusader forces. Still loyal to his homeland, he was thrilled to discover that an army nearby was commanded by the brother of his own count. He sailed up the river to Tarsus and pledged allegiance to Baldwin, who in turn borrowed 300 of his men to help garrison the city. Baldwin likely appointed Geimer as his lieutenant in Tarsus while he prepared to move eastward. Meanwhile, Tancred had reached Adana and found it in disarray. Ossian of Lamperin had recently raided the town and left a force behind, now locked in conflict with the Turks. Adding to the confusion, A Burgundian knight named Welf had forced his way into the city and now occupied the citadel. Upon Tancred's arrival, the Turks withdrew. Welf welcomed Tancred's troops into the citadel and was confirmed in his control of the city. Ashen, likely interested only in retrieving his men from a dangerous situation, expressed gratitude for Tancred's intervention and urged him to press on to Mistra, where the entirely Armenian population longed to be freed from Turkish domination. Ashen was also keen to see the Franks challenge the influence of his rival, Constantine of the Rapinian line. Tancred arrived at Mistra in early October. As an Adana, the Turks fled at his approach, and the city's Christian population gladly opened its gates to him. Not long after, Baldwin and his army caught up. However, Baldwin had apparently already concluded that Cilicia would not be the site of his future domain. The humid and malarial climate in late summer may have dissuaded him, or perhaps he considered it too close to the expanding reach of the Byzantine Empire. His advisor Bagrat was encouraging him to head east, where Armenians were actively seeking his support. At this point, Baldwin had significantly undermined Tancred's prospects of establishing a powerful state in Cilicia. Now, he was preparing to return to the main Crusader force to consult with his brother and allies before launching a new campaign. But Tancred remained wary. He refused Baldwin entry into Mistra and insisted that his rival camp across the Gihon River. Nevertheless, he allowed provisions from the town to be sent to Baldwin's camp. Still, many Normans were enraged that Baldwin had not been punished for the incident at Tarsus. They convinced Tancred to join them in launching a surprise attack on Baldwin's camp. The effort backfired. Baldwin's forces were too numerous and too well organized, and they quickly repelled the attackers, driving them back across the river in disarray. The disgraceful skirmish sparked a backlash. Realizing the futility of their conflict, Baldwin and Tancred reconciled. But the damage was done. It was now painfully evident that the Crusader princes were unwilling to cooperate for the greater cause of Christendom when personal ambition was at stake. The local Christian populations, watching closely, soon understood that their so-called liberators were driven more by self-interest than altruism. It became clear that the most effective strategy was to exploit the divisions among the Franks. Following his reconciliation with Tancred at Mistra, Baldwin quickly made his way back to the main Crusader force at Marash. Word had reached him that his wife, Godvir, was near death, and their children too were ill and would not survive much longer. Baldwin stayed only a few days with his brothers and the other leaders of the army. While the main crusading force began its march south toward Antioch, Baldwin turned eastward to pursue his own ambitions in the Euphrates Valley and the surrounding lands. This time, the group accompanying him was much smaller than the one that had followed him into Cilicia. Perhaps the events at Tarsus had tarnished his reputation as a leader, or perhaps his brothers, now focused on the campaign for Antioch, could not afford to spare any more troops. He had only 100 mounted men with him, but his Armenian advisor Bagrat remained at his side, and he welcomed a new chaplain to his retinue. After Baldwin's departure, Tancred did not stay long in Mistra. Leaving behind a small garrison, he headed south, circling the head of the Gulf of Issus on his way to Alexandretta. During the journey, he dispatched envoys to Geinmer to request his support. Geinmer readily accepted and sailed with his fleet to join Tancred before Alexandretta. Together, they launched a combined assault and captured the town, which Tancred then garrisoned. From there, he crossed the Amanus Mountains through the Syrian gates to rejoin the Crusader army before Antioch. Ultimately, the expedition into Cilicia yielded little benefit for either Baldwin or Tancred. Neither found the region suitable for establishing a permanent principality. The small Frankish garrisons left in the three Cilician towns would be unable to resist any significant military threat. Still, the campaign was not without its merits. By scattering the Turkish garrisons, the Crusaders helped to prevent the region from being used as a base for Turkish attacks on their flank during the siege of Antioch. The capture of Alexandretta also proved strategically useful, providing a port through which supplies could be delivered. However, The greatest beneficiaries of the Cilician campaign were the Armenian princes in the surrounding highlands. With Turkish authority in the region now weakened, they were able to move gradually into the villages and towns of the plains, laying the groundwork for what would become the Armenian Kingdom of Cilicia. When Baldwin split from the main army at Marash, the Crusaders were just beginning their advance toward Antioch. At first, Baldwin followed a route that ran parallel to the main army's path, but slightly farther east, likely to shield its left flank. This responsibility may have served as his justification for separating from the force once more. In fact, the entire eastern expedition could be defended on strategic grounds, as the territory he intended to enter was the most likely corridor for reinforcements coming from Khorasan to reach the Turks at Antioch. Additionally, the fertile lands there held the potential to supply the crusading army with much-needed provisions. At Aintab, Baldwin abruptly turned eastward. It's uncertain whether he had any concrete strategy beyond a general ambition to establish a principality along the Euphrates. The circumstances favored such a move. He wouldn't need to wrest the territory from Muslim control, as much of it was already held by friendly Armenian forces. Baldwin was already in contact with Armenian leaders. Through his advisor Bagrat, he had likely made connections with Bagrat's brother, Kokh Vasil, who held lands directly east of Marash. Gabriel of Melitene, under constant threat from the Danishmend Turks, was probably seeking Western support, while Thuras of Edessa was definitely in communication with the Crusaders. In fact, Baldwin's decision to abandon Cilicia may have been influenced by a message sent by Thuras inviting him to Edessa. For some time, the Armenians had looked to the west for aid. 2 decades earlier, when Pope Gregory VII was considering a military expedition to defend Eastern Christianity, an Armenian bishop had traveled to Rome to win his support. Even those Armenian princes who had accepted Byzantine titles often preferred Western alliances, seeking to free themselves from the yoke of an empire they deeply resented. The arrival of a victorious Frankish army, so close to their borders, presented a long-awaited opportunity to break free of both Turkish and Byzantine dominance. They welcomed Baldwin and his forces with enthusiasm, hailing them as liberators. Today, we are cautious with the word liberation. The Armenians learned that lesson earlier than most. As Baldwin advanced toward the Euphrates, Armenian communities came out to greet him. Remaining Turkish garrisons in the area either fled or were killed by the local Christians. The only significant Turkish leader left nearby was the Emir Balduk of Samosata, who controlled the key road from Edessa to Melitene. He tried to organize a defense, but was unable to take any aggressive action. 2 Armenian nobles, referred to by the Latins as Fair and Nicusus, joined Baldwin with small militias. By the winter of 1097, Baldwin had secured the region as far as the Euphrates, taking control of 2 strategic fortresses, Ravendell and Turbissul. Ravendell, which provided a key communication route to Antioch, was entrusted to Bagrat, while Fair was given command of Turbissul, near the vital Euphrates crossing at Carchemish. Around the new year, while Baldwin remained in Turbissul, an embassy arrived from Edessa. Thuras was growing increasingly anxious as the Franks delayed their advance on the west bank of the Euphrates. His situation was precarious, and news that Kerboga was assembling a vast army en route to Antioch further heightened his concern. That same force could easily crush Edessa and the Armenian territories along the way. Thuras had hoped to hire Baldwin's support through payment and rich gifts, essentially treating him as a mercenary. But Baldwin's ambitions were greater. Now, the Edessian delegation was empowered to offer a more significant proposition. Thuras would adopt Baldwin as his son and heir and immediately share rule with him. This offer was a compromise for Thuras. It wasn't his ideal solution, but with unpopularity at home and pressure from hostile neighbors, he had little choice. Yet some Armenians saw the situation more clearly and grew uneasy. Bagrat, who had mentored Baldwin in Armenian affairs, was among the first to express discontent. While the Franks were still stationed at Turbissul, Fair accused him of conspiring with the Turks. The reality may have been more nuanced. Bagrat was likely consulting with his brother, Kök Vasil, about the rising threat Baldwin now posed to Armenian autonomy. He may have also harbored hopes of ruling Ravendell himself. Baldwin, however, refused to take chances. He swiftly dispatched troops to Ravendell, had Bagrat arrested, and brought him before him to be tortured for information. Bagrat had little to confess and eventually escaped, fleeing to the mountains where Kök Vasil gave him shelter. Eventually, he too would be driven to retreat into the wilderness. In early February 1098, Baldwin departed from Turbisil and made his way toward Edessa, accompanied by only 80 knights. The Turks of Samosata had prepared an ambush at the expected crossing point of the Euphrates, but Baldwin avoided the trap by crossing the river at a more northerly ford. He arrived in Edessa on February 6th, where he was warmly welcomed by Thuras and the entire Christian population of the city. Shortly after his arrival, Thuras officially adopted Baldwin as his son. The ceremony, conducted according to Armenian tradition, was more fitting for a child than for an adult. Baldwin was stripped to the waist, and Thuras donned an oversized shirt, which he pulled over Baldwin's head. The two then pressed their bare chests together to symbolize their new familial bond. Baldwin repeated the same ritual with Thuras's wife, the princess. Now serving as heir and ruler of Edessa, Baldwin recognized that his first objective must be the elimination of the Turkish emirate of Samosata, which posed a constant threat to his Western communications. The Edessene population supported the campaign enthusiastically, since Emir Balduk had long been their most persistent enemy, harassing their lands and, at times, demanding tribute from the city itself. Baldwin led the expedition with his knights, joined by the city's militia and Constantine of Gargar, an Armenian noble under Thuras's authority. The campaign took place between February 14th and 20th, but it ended in failure. The local troops proved ineffective in battle and were caught off guard by the Turks, leading to the deaths of 1,000 men. Following this defeat, the army withdrew. Nevertheless, Baldwin managed to capture and fortify a village named St. John, located near the emir's capital. He stationed the majority of his knights there, aiming to restrict Turkish movements. This strategy led to a significant reduction in Turkish raids, and the Armenians readily credited Baldwin for the improved security. Not long after Baldwin's return to Edessa, a conspiracy against Thuras began to unfold, reportedly with the support of Constantine of Gargar. The exact extent of Baldwin's involvement remains unclear. His supporters denied any connection, though the Armenian chronicler Matthew claimed that Baldwin had been informed of the conspirators' plans to remove Thuras and elevate him instead. Thuras was widely disliked by the people of Edessa. Despite his efforts to maintain the city's independence, his association with the Orthodox Church and his status as a nominal Byzantine official made him unpopular. He was also criticized for failing to protect their goods and harvest from Turkish raiders and for imposing heavy taxes. Until Baldwin's arrival, the people had little choice but to tolerate him. Now, with a stronger leader in their midst, they saw the opportunity to replace him. Whether or not the Franks encouraged the plot, it is unlikely that the conspirators would have acted without at least the passive approval of Baldwin and his men. On Sunday, March 7th, the plan was set into motion. The conspirators incited the populace to attack the homes of Thuras's officials, then marched on the citadel where Thuras resided. Abandoned by his guards and receiving no support from Baldwin, Thuras gave in, requesting only that he and his wife be allowed to withdraw safely to her father's home in Melitene. Although Baldwin appeared to guarantee his safety, Thuras was not permitted to leave. Trapped within his palace, he attempted to escape through a window 2 days later, on Tuesday, but was captured by the mob and torn apart. The fate of his wife, Baldwin's adoptive mother, remains unknown. On Wednesday, March 10th, the people of Edessa formally invited Baldwin to take control of the government. Baldwin had successfully realized his goal of securing a principality. Although Edessa was not situated within the Holy Land, a Frankish-controlled territory along the Middle Euphrates could still serve as a strategic buffer for any future Crusader state in Palestine. In terms of broader crusading objectives, Baldwin could justify his actions. However, from a legal standpoint within Christendom, his claim was far less defensible. Edessa had once belonged to the Byzantine Empire before it was lost to the Turks, which placed it under the terms of the oath Baldwin had sworn at Constantinople. Furthermore, he had seized control by displacing a governor who, at least officially, remained a loyal servant of the empire. But Baldwin had already shown in Cilicia that his oath held little meaning for him. At Edessa, Thurus himself had been willing to surrender his authority without consulting his imperial overlord. Still, Emperor Alexius took note of the incident and would later assert his rights when the opportunity arose. In hindsight, Armenian historians expressed harsh criticism of Baldwin. However, such judgment may have been unfair. Baldwin's treatment of Thurus lacked moral justification, a fact reflected in the uneasy tone of contemporary Latin chroniclers. Yet Thurus himself had once invited the Turkish leader Alphalag to aid him against the Danishmends and later had the man killed. In that instance, however, Thurus had acted to save his city from infidel oppression, and there had been no symbolic act of adoption involved. While Armenian customs treated adoption less formally than Western law, this still does not absolve Baldwin of moral responsibility. That said, the blame does not lie solely with him. It was the Armenians themselves who murdered Thurus and who, almost unanimously, welcomed Baldwin as their new ruler. The Armenian nobles whom the Crusaders would later displace were primarily those who had served the Byzantine Empire. They were resented by their fellow Armenians for their imperial loyalties and, even more so, for having embraced the Orthodox faith. These men, like Thurus and Gabriel, were among the few with the administrative experience necessary to maintain Armenian autonomy along the Euphrates. Yet their own people, driven by hostility toward Byzantium and a willingness to overlook in Latins the very heresies they condemned in Greeks, contributed to their downfall. In the end, it was their misplaced faith in their Frankish allies that led them toward ruin. For the time being, everything appeared to be going well. Baldwin assumed the title of Count of Edessa and made it clear that he intended to govern independently. However, with only a limited number of Frankish soldiers at his disposal, he had no choice but to depend on the support of the local Armenian population. Fortunately, he found several Armenians he could trust, and his task became significantly easier following the discovery of a vast treasure hoard in the citadel. Much of this wealth dated back to Byzantine times and had been increased substantially by Thurus through heavy taxation. This unexpected fortune gave Baldwin the means to both secure loyalty and carry out a brilliant diplomatic move. Alarmed by Baldwin's rise to power, the Emir Balduc of Samosata, seeing new preparations for an assault on his capital, quickly offered to sell his territory for 10,000 bezants. Baldwin accepted the deal and entered Samosata in triumph. Within its citadel, he found many hostages who had been taken from Edessa. He promptly returned them to their families, an act that, combined with the removal of the Turkish threat from the region, greatly boosted his popularity. Balduc was even welcomed to Edessa, along with his personal guard, now serving as mercenaries under Baldwin. As Baldwin's achievements became more widely known, several Western knights who were en route to Antioch decided to divert and join him. Others, weary of the prolonged siege of Antioch, also came to share in his growing fortune. Among these were Drogo of Nesle, Reynold of Toul, and Gaston of Barn, a vassal of Raymond. Baldwin rewarded their service with generous gifts from his treasury and encouraged them to integrate by marrying Armenian noble women. Leading by example, Baldwin took an Armenian bride himself. His new wife was the daughter of a local chieftain referred to in Latin chronicles as Tafnas or Tafrock. This prince owned nearby lands and was possibly related to Constantine of Gargar. He also had ties to Constantinople, where he eventually retired. It's possible he was the same individual as Thatul, ruler of Marash, whose alliance would have been politically valuable to Baldwin. The daughter came with a dowry of 60,000 bezants and a loosely stated promise that she would inherit her father's estates. However, the marriage brought her no joy, and no children resulted from their union. In this way, Baldwin laid the foundations for the policy he would later implement in the Kingdom of Jerusalem. Governance would remain firmly in the hands of the Frankish nobility, but people of the East were to be included in the state's administration. Over time, this approach aimed to blend the diverse populations into a unified political entity. While it reflected the vision of a pragmatic statesman, many knights newly arrived from the West saw it as a betrayal of the crusading mission. They had not taken up the cross, inspired by Pope Urban's call at Clermont, only to witness their leaders establish semi-oriental monarchies in distant lands. Baldwin's strategy was not easy to maintain in its early stages. The Muslims viewed him as a temporary figure. Southwest of Edessa, between the city and the Euphrates, lay the Muslim town of Saraj. Though it had once paid tribute to the Ortakid prince Balak ibn Bahram, it had recently rebelled. Balak reached out to Baldwin, proposing to hire him to suppress the revolt. Baldwin, pleased by this new opportunity, agreed to undertake the mission. However, the people of Saraj secretly appealed to Balduc for help. Balduc and his forces quietly left Edessa and were welcomed into Saraj. Baldwin soon followed, bringing siege engines with him. Faced with this show of strength, both Balduc and the residents of Saraj lost their resolve. The townspeople immediately offered to surrender and pay tribute, while Balduc came forward, claiming he had only entered the city to secure it for Baldwin. Baldwin, unconvinced but outwardly accepting the explanation, appeared to forgive him. Yet, a few days later, Baldwin demanded that Balduc surrender his wife and children as hostages. When he hesitated, Baldwin had him arrested and beheaded. A Frankish garrison was then stationed in Saraj under the command of Fulk of Chartres. This incident taught Baldwin a harsh lesson. Muslim allies could not be trusted. From that point on, he ensured that Muslims living within his domain remained without local leadership. Still, he permitted them religious freedom. In a city like Saraj, where the population was overwhelmingly Arab and Muslim, such tolerance was essential. However, this policy of religious tolerance shocked many in the West. The fall of Saraj, followed months later by the capture of Byrgic, helped Baldwin secure control over the routes linking Edessa with his other strongholds, Turbisal and Ravendell. This not only solidified his principality, but also ensured reliable communication with the main crusading army. His growing power sent a strong message to Muslim forces, prompting them to focus on eliminating him. This became clear in May when Kerboga, en route to relieve Antioch, paused to try and crush Baldwin. For 3 weeks, he unsuccessfully besieged Edessa before giving up. His failure boosted Baldwin's prestige, and the delay he caused was crucial in aiding the broader crusade. But Baldwin also misjudged his Armenian subjects. They were troubled by the increasing presence of Frankish knights in their lands and resented the privileges Baldwin granted them. The Franks, in turn, treated the Armenians with open contempt and, at times, brutality. The local Armenian elite found themselves shut out of Baldwin's governing council, which was exclusively Frankish, and taxes remained as burdensome as they had been under Thuris. Additionally, Armenian lands in rural areas were being distributed to Western newcomers, who imposed strict feudal systems unfamiliar and unwelcome to local farmers. Toward the end of 1098, Baldwin was alerted to a plot against his life, revealed by an Armenian informant. The conspiracy reportedly involved 12 prominent townsmen who had been communicating with Turkish emirs in the Diyarbakir region. At the time, Baldwin's father-in-law, Tafnaz, was staying in Edessa following the recent wedding of his daughter to Baldwin. Rumor had it that the plotters hoped to replace Baldwin with Tafnaz, or at least force Baldwin to share power with him. Upon learning of the scheme, Baldwin acted swiftly. The 2 main conspirators were arrested and blinded. Others had their noses or feet cut off. Many more were thrown into prison, and their wealth was seized. Yet, like many cautious Easterners, they had hidden their fortunes well. When Baldwin's officials failed to uncover these hidden caches, he permitted the prisoners to purchase their release. Although Tafnaz's involvement could not be proven, he wisely chose to retreat to his mountain territories, distancing himself from his fearsome son-in-law. Along with him, he took most of the dowry promised to Baldwin's wife. Baldwin's harsh suppression of the conspiracy effectively eliminated any further threats from his Armenian subjects. Although he continued to appoint a few of them to prominent roles, he became increasingly indifferent to the native population as more Frankish knights arrived, drawn by his rising fame. Within less than a year of taking control in Edessa, Baldwin's reputation had grown immensely. While the main Crusader army was still struggling on its journey toward Jerusalem, he had already established a prosperous and formidable principality deep within Asia. His name commanded both fear and respect across the Eastern world. Baldwin had embarked on the crusade as the youngest son in his family, without wealth or position, reliant on the support of his brothers. Overshadowed at first by powerful nobles like Raymond of Toulouse, Hugh of Vermandois, and seasoned warriors like Bohemond, Baldwin had now surpassed them all in authority. Among the leaders of the crusade, he had emerged as the most capable and politically astute figure.